You're listening to the Security Matters podcast. I'm David Puner, a senior editorial manager at CyberArk, the global leader in identity security. Imagine this. A global bank discovers over 30,000 service accounts scattered across its systems. No one knows who created them or what they still access. Some date back years, tied to unmonitored cloud workloads with active privileges but no oversight. And the number keeps growing. This isn't just a one-off scenario. As cloud adoption accelerates, machine identities now outnumber human identities by more than 80 to 1. Unchecked, they become vulnerabilities, entry points for attackers. It's a new kind of identity crisis, one that demands not just governance, but a complete mindset shift. Addressing these risks reduces cyber risk, ensures compliance, and builds resilience in an increasingly complex digital landscape. Today, I'm joined by Deepak Taneja, founder of Zilla Security and now General Manager of Identity Governance at CyberArk. Deepak's built platforms that bridge security, compliance, and cloud innovation. Our discussion explores how identity has become the new foundation of enterprise security, why this year may be the biggest inflection point yet, and what organizations need to do to stay ahead. Let's dive in. Deepak Taneja, co-founder of Zilla Security and general manager of identity governance at CyberArk. Welcome to the podcast.
Thanks for having me on the podcast, David.
Absolutely. Really excited to speak with you today. You came over to CyberArk earlier this year by way of the acquisition of Zilla Security, which you co-founded and were the CEO. What sparked the idea for Zilla, and how does joining CyberArk fit into your broader career path?
When my co-founder and I started Zilla Security in 2019, we felt that identity was sort of at an inflection point. IT and security leaders were starting to realize that identity was replacing the network as the new foundation of enterprise security. The industry has been talking about zero trust for more than 15 years. But the implications of that in terms of authorization, entitlements, compliance, and security was really starting to kick in around 2019, 2020. And as the adoption of the cloud accelerated, organizations were realizing that having an identity provider for the cloud wasn't enough.
Mm-hmm.
They needed identity security to manage who has access to what in a way that could scale to hundreds or thousands of cloud applications, millions of resources, some dynamic, and both human and non-human identities. And so that's shift in the perception of identity led us to say, well, there's an opportunity here for a modern identity governance and security solution.
So before the founding of Zilla in 2019, you had been in the identity space for quite some time. What had you been doing in the identity space? When did that start? And how did your perception of what identity or identity security is over time evolve?
I've spent almost my entire career in identity. So I started out as a developer in the 80s working on directory services software. This is before there was a security space. And went from there in the early days of the internet to being part of the founding team of a company called Integrity, which led the shift to web-based single sign-on and directory-enabled authentication. Of course, those were the days of LDAP directories and so on. And Integrity was a leader in that space. I was the head of engineering there. We got acquired, and I founded a company called Avexa, which was the pioneer in identity governance. And now I'm talking 2004, 2005. And large organizations were already starting to worry about compliance. And this was in the wake of the bust of 2000 and all the scandals around Enron and WorldCom and so on, and the regulatory mandates that were coming down from the federal government and various state governments, so SOX and so on. And so I've sort of seen, and Avexa, led that space for many, many years. We were joined in the market by SailPoint and others, and Avexa was eventually acquired by RSA. So I've been fortunate to have been at the sort of the forefront of identity for a long time. And in the mid 2000s, 2010 onwards, the cloud has come along and we've seen this big shift, and zero trust started to become talked about. But it wasn't until 2018, 2019 timeframe when really this notion of identity becoming the new foundation of enterprise security was starting to take hold. And so I've sort of seen how that whole shift happened over the last 20, 25 years. And for me, joining CyberArk fits very well in my career arc. So as an entrepreneur, you want to change the world. And while we were making progress changing the world in the modern IGA swim lane, as it were, joining CyberArk gave me the opportunity to change the world in a much more significant way. So PAM, privileged access management, identity security, IGA, they're all coming together. The business drivers around security, compliance, ease of use, they are making that convergence happen. And the opportunity to create the identity security platform of the future and help engineer this shift in the industry was very attractive to me.
Let's dive into identity governance and IGA. So to level set here, or to set the stage, or however you want to say it at the top of this conversation, at a high level, what is identity governance and administration, aka IGA, and why has identity governance historically been so difficult to get right?
Identity governance is fundamentally very simple. The concept is it's all about entitlements. It's the entitlements that identities have. It's the administration of who or what has access to what.
Mm-hmm.
How do you discover the current state of entitlements in the organization? How do you review them for compliance? How do you assign them so people can do their jobs? How do you ensure that they are correct? How do you remove them when people leave the organization or they get off a project? So this space was originally important, as I said, for compliance back in the mid 2000s. And then because regulations like SOX demanded it. And then the lifecycle administration, lifecycle management, the notion of a joiner process, mover process, a leaver process, provisioning, deprovisioning, all of that joined compliance and became IGA. So IGA had two business drivers, compliance and lifecycle management. And that made sense because you really don't want to have the source of truth for entitlements in two different places. You need a source of truth for compliance, and you need a source of truth for lifecycle management. So it makes so much sense to bring those two together and have a single source of truth that's always in touch with what your current state of entitlements are, and that always knows how to make changes to that current state, right? Now, in the cloud era, security has become a new driver. So this notion of who has access to what, putting controls over who or what has access to what. And of course, non-human identities, machines, APIs are all over the place now. It isn't just about human identities, but who or what has access to what has become critical from a security angle. And all of this, your question about why is this hard to get right? It's difficult to get right partly because of organizational complexity. It's the nature of the beast. You're dealing with identity. Identity touches everything in an organization. It touches all the business processes. And if you think about the stakeholders in identity governance, those stakeholders range from supervisors to application owners, both business owners of applications and technical owners of applications. Stakeholders include compliance people, risk people, auditors. All of those people have needs and all of them have some context. And you sort of have to think about identity governance in terms of business processes that involve all of these stakeholders. You have to bring all of them together into these business processes. So identity governance, or IGA, as a lot of us like to call it, is somewhat unique in the security world. A lot of security products are essentially used by the security team. IGA is about business processes that a lot of folks in the organization interact with. And that's what makes it complicated, right? And that's why it's hard to get right. Now, what's also happened is that the vendors and the technology in this space has sort of been somewhat static going from the late 2000s to for about 10 years. And so while those technologies were designed for an on-prem world, we've had this rapid shift in terms of the cloud environments taking over. And the cloud has sort of broken the old legacy identity governance model, which was very dependent on professional services, very dependent on manual work, very dependent on crafting a new integration to an application or a system by hand. This cloud scale is something that those technologies were not designed for. So historically, it's always been hard to get right because of the organizational complexity, because of the business process needs. I think it's become much harder to deal with today when an enterprise tries to use a legacy solution to make that happen.
You had mentioned risks. So, what are the biggest risks that organizations face when governance is slow or incomplete?
That has a lot to do with the compliance work or the lifecycle management work that has to happen. And so, unfortunately, the risk here is that much of that it ends up getting done manually, which takes a lot of effort. It's expensive, it's inaccurate, and productivity suffers. Employees don't get the entitlements they need to do their job quickly. And that's if you think about it from a compliance and lifecycle management perspective. When you think about it with the new lens, which includes security, the big risk is that the security posture is weak. There are excessive entitlements. There are orphan accounts. There are service accounts that have been lying around for years. And there's no governance really around a lot of that. IGA started as a checkbox compliance issue sort of 20 years ago, but it's grown into this remarkably important deployment because identity has become so fundamental to enterprise security. Now it's all about identity, right? And when it's about identity and you can't get your arms around, what the identities are and what access they have, then you can't do compliance right. Your scope of compliance is limited. You're doing a lot of manual work. You're spending a lot of money doing it. Your people are not getting access quickly. So if you tell a DevOps engineer, someone in engineering, for example, that it's going to take them a week to get productive, they're going to be really mad at you. So the base of business demands a much faster, much more secure, much more easy to use, much more automated solution. And that's become fundamental.
Earlier, you had mentioned the cloud as being a game changer for IGA. What's changed most dramatically, technologically or otherwise, in the identity governance space over the past few years?
The demands of the cloud era are really centered around what's happening with SaaS, with cloud infrastructure platforms, with digital transformation. I think the big issues are organizations today have hundreds of thousands of SaaS apps in use, and they're building their own applications. That's digital transformation, right? And they all have their own engineering teams. They have their own DevOps teams. And part of this is in the cloud world, it isn't just human identities. It's much more dynamic. There's ephemeral access. There's lots of non-human identities. And In fact, non-human identities are dwarfing in many organizations the number of human identities.
Right.
So that's a big change in the identity governance space. And we're just starting to see that now. We call NHIs, as they say, machines, call it what you will. There's a recognition that there needs to be a strong focus on that. But the auditors are starting to wake up to the compliance issues there. And most organizations have been doing user access reviews, so access reviews for employees in the organization. The auditors now and various standards bodies are starting to push the large financial services companies, for example, to start reviewing the access that non-human identities have. So that's a big change in the cloud era.
Our recent 2025 identity security landscape report found that machine identities now outnumber human identities by more than 80 to 1.
Exactly. And that trend is going to continue. We're now sort of moving from the cloud era to the AI era. I think of that as the next big shift that's happening. And I think our organizations are, over the next few years, going to have hundreds of thousands of AI agents that are doing all kinds of work. So it isn't even just about machines and APIs. We're going to the next frontier is about agent identities. And so that's going to need compliance. That's going to need joiner, mover, lever processes and so on. I think the other issue we've talked about already is really security, managing security risk. Least privileged security as a concept has been around for 25 years, but least privileged security really wasn't driving IGA in the early days. Compliance was. Today, the security is a really important driver in identity governance, becoming more and more important.
AI and agentic AI, which you just brought up. You recently described a future of identity governance that's fast, secure, and scalable. What does that modern vision for identity governance look like, and how do AI and agentic AI bring that vision to life?
I think that if security, as we said, is a new driver for IGA, the future is about easy integration of systems, automation, and a simple user experience. That's how identity governance will scale in this new world of human and non-human identities, rapidly expanding environment that's much more dynamic than it ever was. And I can't stress the need for automation too much. Automation is the key. That's what can deliver a simple self-service user experience. That's what can deliver ease of deployment. And AI, agentic AI, takes automation to the next level. If today in an organization, IGA is 80% manual, 20% automation, the future that I see is going to be 20% manual or 10% manual and 80% automation. And much of that automation will come from AI. AI agents will start by providing insight and recommendations. And we're seeing that already, right? And I think the shift that's going to happen is they'll actually start doing the governance work themselves to a degree. So we're going to see this shift from just making recommendations to, oh, the agent is trusted enough at this point, at some point, so it can actually go make some decisions. And when all of this comes together in terms of automation, organizations will get the quick time to value that they're looking for, and essentially IGA that keeps up with the pace of business. When I described the future as fast, secure, and scalable, that's sort of what I meant.
It may seem obvious, but why is time to value such a critical metric?
Yeah, time to value is a great overall metric that CISOs should be looking at for everything.
Okay.
And particularly for identity governance, given the history in this space. So I think most organizations have struggled with legacy IGA products and legacy deployments around IGA. It's taken them years to onboard systems and so on. So it's a great metric because it it helps an organization figure out how quickly they get key applications integrated and hit their certain value milestones. So, for example, if an organization wants compliance out of their IGA solution, if they start with, okay, I want to make sure that I'm getting the identity compliance I'm looking for, that first user access review, that first review of, let's say 30,000 employees across the organization, done by, let's say 6,000 supervisors, a supervisory access review. How quickly can I hit that milestone? That's time to value, right? A medium-sized organization might say, I've got 25 key applications and I want to do access reviews based on the application owners. So I want application owners to review who has access to their applications. How quickly can an organization get application owner access reviews for all 25 applications done? That's time to value. And I think if it's 6 weeks or 6 months or 2 years, that's a big difference, right? In all of this. If you think about this from a life cycle management perspective, how quickly can the volume of manual provisioning tickets be reduced by, let's say, 50%? That's a great time to value metric. And I'll get on my metric soapbox for a minute. I think IGA sort of needs to be outcome driven. A lot of us in the industry use terms like more, better, enhanced, reduced, quicker. Whether it's compliance or operational efficiency or security, speaking in terms of adjectives doesn't really help CISOs manage an identity program. I think security teams need to think in terms of metrics, in terms of the value provided by deployment. What are the outcomes as measured by metrics? If you're not measuring it, you're not really managing it. You may be muddling through, you may be getting by, but if you can't answer some simple questions about metrics, and by the way, most identity teams can, then you're not on a path to really improving your governance.
You've talked about the need for AI, not just to manage entitlements, but to anticipate where attackers will strike next. So, what does that look like in practice, and how close are we to seeing AI-driven identity threat protection become mainstream?
A very large number of smart people are now focused on using AI to solve problems in security and identity. The number of people working on this has gone up by perhaps an order of magnitude recently and continues to go up dramatically. So AI is great at slicing and dicing large data sets.
Mm-hmm.
And if you think about it, every organization has a huge amount of data about what human identities and non-human identities are doing every day. What are the responsibilities of those identities, and what do they have access to, and how are they leveraging that access, from which devices, from which location, and so on. And all that data can be leveraged by AI to predict and to actually catch imminent breaches or figure out when there's an imminent threat. And I think that's going to happen. It's going to take some time, but it's definitely, we're going to shift into that mode. There are practical challenges. All of this data is sitting in a lot of different places across the enterprise. The activity data is sitting in log files and so on. It's not easy to get the right semantics out of all these different files. In the early going, many vendors have focused on Active Directory or the identity providers as a source of data for identity threat detection. But that's not enough. IGA and this whole space needs to get much closer to security, incident management, event management, the SOC infrastructure. And those SIMs and SOCs need to become much more identity aware. This is also, by the way, an organizational problem, because I think if you go talk to a CISO, he or she will say, yeah, my My identity team doesn't understand threat detection and remediation, and my SOC team understands threat detection, remediation, but doesn't understand identity. So we've got to bring those two teams together. I think AI will help make that happen over time.
You've already touched upon it a little bit, but to hit it straight on, why is it important to think about identity governance as part of a broader identity security strategy?
Yeah, this is what's exciting, I think, about the future of identity and identity security. Historically, privileged access management solutions vaulted privileged credentials for infrastructure resources and sort of rotated credentials like passwords and so on. But they were focused on mostly just IT users and infrastructure elements. And IGA was off on the side, sort of dealing with compliance and lifecycle management. And it was focused on all users, all resources, but it was off on the side. And I think there's a realization, but organizations, of course, needed both PAM, privileged access management, and IGA to establish the right controls over who gets access to what. It was just the controls you put on everyone are different than the controls you put on your most sensitive folks in IT who have access to the crown jewels of the organization. But with the shift to the cloud, enterprises now are looking at many more identities connecting to many more resources. You have humans, machines, agents, and on the resource side, you have applications, SaaS, homegrown, data, infrastructure, and so on. And millions of credentials, millions of entitlements. So what are the right privilege controls now? And I think what's happening in the industry is that privilege access management and IGA are starting to align around a new common axis of control. So it's a single common view of identity and what identities should be allowed to do. It's a single view of resources, how they're protected. So organizations need a common framework to make these decisions about what privilege controls to put on which identities and which resources, right? So our motto at CyberArk, of course, is the right privilege controls for the right identities. And that's the new vision that sort of underlies this identity security platform of the future, making decisions about the right controls based on the risk of the resources and the business responsibilities of the different identities. And this notion of a common framework is what's bringing IGA and privilege access management and machine identity management. Because as I said, it's about non-human identities as much as human identities. It's bringing all of that together into an identity security platform. If you think about it today, it doesn't make sense to vault credentials for everything. You vault credentials for some things, for a lot of things. It's about just-in-time access. It's about zero standing privileges. And so the future is about a range of privilege controls heading ultimately towards more and more zero standing privileges and a lot of just-in-time access. That's the new vision of identity security. And I think CyberArk is leading the transition to sort of this new axis of access control, combining the classic approaches with the modern approaches with machine identity management and IGA.
Let's stay on identity security for a moment. You've called 2025 an inflection point for identity security, particularly due to overlooked dependencies like interlinked machine identities. How can organizations proactively identify identities and mitigate these hidden risks before attackers exploit them?
I think it's an inflection point for identity security. These different drivers sort of coming together and this realization that non-human identities are just as important, perhaps more important than human identities. And of course, they're interlinked because you really can't get governance over machine identities unless you figure out who the human identities are that own those machine identities. A very common problem in organizations is service accounts. So just the other day, I was speaking with a large bank that said to me, we have 30,000 service accounts. A lot of these service accounts are used by machines. A lot of them are used by applications. So there's workloads, there's cloud workloads. So you have an application that has different workloads, and these identities, these accounts are used by them. But we have no way of figuring all this out. We have no idea when these were created and how to look after them. We just realized that we have a problem that's getting worse and worse and worse. So how do we get our arms around this, right? And if you think about that, there are these workloads that are running that are using all these service accounts. You have to be able to, in some sense, track them back to an application or a service of some sort, and then figure out, okay, who is the person that is the owner of this application or this service? There's got to be someone that started this whole process, right? There has to be someone who has the business rationale for this application or this workload. And that person is absolutely key to providing identity security, to providing identity governance in this case. If that person leaves the organization, for example, someone needs to be alerted so that responsibility can move to a new person. But when it comes to what these workloads or what these service accounts actually get access to, perhaps that person is in the best position to make that decision. So human identities and non-human identities, they're interlinked, and there are these cross dependencies, and organizations need to sort of proactively identify all of these identities and establish what those links are. And only then can they start to put the right business processes in place that help them with governance and security.
So then, are there any cultural or mindset shifts you think are essential for organizations to succeed in today's identity landscape?
Yeah, I think the big mindset shift, there's several, but I think a very important one is to not think about an identity as just being a human identity. You have to start thinking about identity much more holistically. It can be human, it can be non-human. And if we do that, organizations will make a lot of good decisions. I think the second mindset shift is we need to get rid of this siloed approach where identity teams are just thinking about the processes for managing identity. They're not thinking about security risks and security remediation and threats, and they're not thinking about alerts that need to go to someone in the SOC. And then the security ops team or the SOC team is thinking about threats, but they're still kind of tuned in to network-based threats, if you will, or host-based threats or endpoint-based threats, right? So we went through this whole era in detection and response of host detection and endpoint detection and managed detection. Well, it's now about identity. Identity is the foundation, the new foundation of enterprise security. So identity threat detection and response is critical. I think those are a couple of key areas where mindset shifts are in order.
Before we get to the last question, you've got lots of album covers behind you in your backdrop. I see The Doors, LA Woman, Beatles, Abbey Road, Fleetwood Mac, and you say there are lots of others. I see 6. Do you have a favorite album cover?
That's a longer conversation. I think Prince was a genius. And there's just something about his music that I don't know where it came from, where it sprung from, but that is one of my favorite albums and perhaps my favorite album cover. But I like all of them. Fleetwood Mac is classic as well.
Prince, a great innovator.
It's all about innovation, right? And
yeah,
he was an innovator. He was absolutely an innovator.
Let's look into the future for a moment, as sometimes we like to do at the end of these episodes. If you had to make one bold prediction about where identity governance is headed in the next, 3 to 5 years, or you could create your own time frame, what would it be?
Things always take longer to happen than we think, but I think the big shift here is non-human identities. And a prediction I will make is that in 5 years, we will be talking as an industry much more about non-human identity governance than we are about human identity governance. I think that's how quickly the AI shift is going to happen. And that's how quickly the security risks of ignoring non-human identities are going to come home to us.
Deepak Taneja, thank you so much for coming on to the podcast. Really appreciate it and look forward to having you back on in the not-so-distant future when machine identities will outnumber human identities by who knows how many.
Thank you, David.
All right, there you have it. Thanks for listening to Security Matters. If you like this episode, please follow us wherever you do your podcast thing so you can catch new episodes as they drop. And if you feel so inclined, please leave us a review. We'd appreciate it very much, and so will the algorithmic wins. What else? Drop us a line with questions, comments, and if you're a cybersecurity professional and you have an idea for an episode, drop us a line. Our email address is securitymatterspodcast, all one word, @cyberark.com. We hope to see you next time.